Good morning. I'm Barry Palmer with the Coates Rose Law Firm. We're proud to be a sponsor here today of the conference. We at Coates Rose represent developers, nonprofit and for-profit developers of affordable housing, as well as housing authorities around the country who are working to rebuild their aging stock of public housing. We're particularly proud to work here in Austin with the City of Austin Housing Authority, who is one of the most innovative housing authorities in the country and has had a great deal of success in their efforts to expand their inventory of affordable housing and to provide workforce housing. I have worked across the state of Texas in every city, and I can tell you that the City of Austin is the most progressive in considering affordable housing as a major issue that needs to be addressed. And I applaud the leadership here at the city for making affordable housing a critical issue. And with that, this morning I'd like to introduce our panel. We have Mayor Steve Adler, Dedrick Asante-Muhammad, for the Chief of Equity and Inclusion at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and Richard Reeves at the Brookings Institute, who we just heard from. Steve Adler was elected Austin's 52nd mayor in December of 2014, and he is currently serving his second term. Mayor Adler has led the City of Austin's government to a new level of inclusive civic engagement between residents and elected officials, and he has worked hard to improve the quality of life for everyone in Austin. He has been a champion of affordable housing in Austin and played a key leadership role in supporting the 2018 Affordable Housing Bond referendum. Mayor Adler practiced law for many years and served nearly 10 years as Chief of Staff and General Counsel for Texas State Senator Elliott Shipley, working primarily on school finance, equity, and access issues. Mayor Adler has been deeply involved with and has chaired many Austin civic and nonprofit institutions over the past 20 years. Dedrick Asante-Muhammad is Chief of Equity and Inclusion at NCRC, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. National Community Reinvestment Coalition and its grassroots member organizations create opportunities for people to build wealth through working with community leaders, policymakers, and financial institutions to champion fairness in banking, housing, and business. He oversees NCRC's fair housing, fair lending, and small business programs. Dedrick is known for his racial economic inequality analysis, particularly as it relates to the racial wealth divide. Dedrick comes from Prosperity Now, where he was a senior fellow and founder of the Racial Wealth Divide Initiative. Before Prosperity Now, Dedrick worked for the NAACP, where he was the Senior Director of the Economic Department and Executive Director of the Financial Freedom Center. Thank you, Rex Jones, for introducing our third panelist, Richard Reeves, earlier. Please join me in welcoming Mayor Steve Adler, Dedrick Asante-Muhammad, and Richard Reeves to kick off today's Housing and Equitable Community Summit with the Keynote Texas Conversation.
Now, I've never done a Texas conversation before, so I'm wondering if, I don't know if the mayor knows how a Texas conversation starts, but we'll look to you.
Well, I thought that the presentation we just saw was really good.
Let's leave it there.
And I think that, my observation from that, and then maybe you can give one real quickly. And one, I want to say it's a honor to be here in front of this group. This group and the sponsors of this group are doing just incredibly valuable work at the front line. These are the people in our community that helped get a $250 million housing bond passed, 4 times larger than anything we'd ever done before. I was just in meetings yesterday with Mayor Pro Tem. I see here Delia Garza with us. She helped lead the council through the decision that we made last week to modify the zoning and regulatory standards of housing in this city so that we could maximize and leverage that $250 million bond farther than it would go otherwise. And now we have to have the harder but same conversation as we pick back up the rewrite of our land development code from where we put it aside last August. My hope is we'll get that done this year in a material way in our community. I think the votes exist on the council to actually get something done. But to your point, I think that all of the market forces operating by themselves, all of the cultural values put on auto set will not get us to a more equitable community and will not change the course and path that we're on. It takes real deliberate, specific action. And every one of those deliberate, specific actions will have lots of really good reasons. You can make a moral case against all of the things that we need to do. You can just make a better moral case that we have to do them. But if it were just black and white, it would be so much easier and it would be happening. But it's because it's not easy and because you can make moral arguments on both sides. You can make equitable arguments on both sides. That it really takes a determined effort, and that's what makes it hard. We had the police shooting 2-3 years ago when David Joseph was running down the street naked, shot by the police and killed. And out of that came the task force on institutional racism and systemic inequities that really built on the theme that you couldn't look at that incident in isolation, that there was nothing that was happening in that environment that wasn't happening in access to capital issues. There was nothing there that wasn't happening in education and healthcare delivery. There was nothing that was happening there that wasn't existing in housing. All of the things we need to do are facially apparent. They're just hard to do. So it takes a community like this. It takes you talking to your friends, going beyond the work that you're doing. It's bringing it up at parties. It's talking about it on the sidelines of the soccer fields. It is building the moral resolve in a community, the change in culture that Richard was talking about. I believe that we have a city that is primed and ready to do that.
I'm so interested that you make the moral argument. I actually would love to hear you both talk about the politics of this a bit more, because I think it is just that how do you create the political space in order to bring this about? But because people will very often make the economic case, and you can make the economic case, and the Reinvestment Coalition would make that X jobs, blah blah blah. Sometimes, though, I think it's better to make a strong moral argument than a sort of socio-economic argument. But I'd love to hear you both talk about how do you get the politics of this right and the morality of this right, as well as the policies right?
Yeah, and I don't think that's my necessarily expertise on getting I wish it was, that I knew how to get the politics right, and then I would just get the politics right all throughout the country and we'd solve this. But, and I guess I'm oftentimes hesitant, because this is, I think, the challenging part of the conversation. People want to put forward, let's make the moral argument, because people assume we're all moral, and we have the same morality, and that once the moral argument's put forward, we will just go forward and do what's correct. But I think your work really kind of helps highlight this idea of dream hoarders, that a lot of us are not as giving as we like to think of ourselves if we particularly see the giving might threaten our own circumstance, right? It's one thing to say we want the poor to rise, but it's another thing to say is what am I willing to sacrifice to have a more equitable society? And I think, that's the challenge. And, I've done, the last thing I did, I just came to NCRC about 6 weeks ago. It was like the first time I've heard the NCRC introduction. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. I got it. I think my assistant wrote it. I haven't even heard it yet. But the last few things I did in Prosperity Now was write these racial wealth divide profiles in Dallas and in Austin. I had done similar ones in Baltimore, New York, Miami, New Orleans, South Bend, Indiana. And so, but Texas was very interesting to me, Austin in particular, because most cities, we're looking at cities that had gone through kind of, still dealing with the deindustrialization. Like 50 years later, still dealing with that. The economies are weak. Austin was one of the few places where you actually had a strong economy. And I think one of the big takeaways for me with that and getting to look at Austin was, really helps decouple what we like to put forward, that if the economy is growing, inequality will be solved, right? Or racial equity will occur. But it was a great space to really look at Austin. I think was really excited to hear the mayor say that, because I do believe this is true, without deep intentional action at every step around racial economic inequality, all you're going to do is further cement racial economic inequality. And the evidence in that is, look at racial economic inequality. 1963 March in Washington for freedom and jobs, right? Blacks had twice the unemployment rate of whites. 2019, blacks pretty much still have twice the unemployment rate of whites. I focus in on wealth, and I think that's one thing I'd like to put forward a little bit in relation to your work, is that I think when income is a measure, but like we know, and I'm sure, through your research that, white high school graduates still have about twice the wealth of black and Latinos with college degrees. Right, and so there's this nuance. I think wealth is a much better analysis of the foundation of economic security, economic insecurity. And I think when we look at that, we can start seeing why there is such problems with economic mobility for African Americans, Latinos. Because it doesn't matter if you're high income, if you don't have much wealth, you hit an economic bump in the road, and you decline. You're unable to move forward. So I'm really interested in seeing. I think the great thing about Austin is sometimes it can be easier to have these conversations when everyone's moving forward in some way, and that is true, but it's not apparent to me that it's so easy to have the conversation that in any way Austin's on the path to bridging racial economic inequality. I'll end on this depressing note. In all the cities I've looked at, I haven't seen a city that I felt is really on the path to bridging racial economic inequality and can point to as a model of dealing with this inequality that's solidifying, even as cities are becoming more and more people of color. And it's going to have a more and more detrimental effect to the economy of the city as a whole. So I stick to more of my economic argument, because I'm not clear the morality is going to, the country hasn't had the history of morality bringing people over to address these issues.
I want to hear you on this.
I think it has to be deliberate action, and I think that the moral argument doesn't carry you there. But I think that if you have the moral and the cultural underpinning, I think it makes the political action that much easier. So look at our community. The last November election, I think, was an incredible election. I won. That was good.
There you go.
But more significant than that was the degree to which the bonds won. A housing bond that's winning with 70, 75, 80% are bonds. That was incredible. The fact that we, beat back the Koch dark money Proposition K was reaffirming for a community like Austin. But the most telling thing that happened on election that day was the Proposition J vote. So we had, we're in a 5-year, 6-year process to redo our land development code. Really contentious, mostly falling apart on the issue of compatibility standards. How do you actually drive the density on the corridors and in the centers of our city? How do you create the missing middle opportunities in a city and still preserve the neighborhoods the way that they are? We stopped the process because it was not something that was going to happen. And we had an election, and we're now picking that back up. And again, my hope is that we take what had been a 5-year conversation. We've talked about it for a long time, and I hope that we get that resolved this year in important material ways. But the election, on that vote, when you looked at where people voted, the highest propositions in voting in our city, this was a proposition that basically said, we got dangerously close to approving a land development code rewrite. Lest we get that close again, let's adopt a rule that says that before we can actually approve something like that, it has to go to a popular vote with a 2-year delay before we can get to a popular vote. I mean, it was about as strong a status quo proposition as you could get.
Wow.
And the people that were supporting that were the people that were leading the effort in opposition to the land development code rewrite that we were working. And we saw all the signs in the yards, and the signs in the yards that said kill the land development code rewrites were then changed with vote yes on Proposition J. Same home, same sign, same political effort and machinery. But the vote in our city, the strongest vote against that proposition were the neighborhoods where those signs existed. The strongest vote in our community. If you haven't seen it, you should see the map of how people voted. The core neighborhoods, the legacy neighborhoods in our city were the ones that voted overwhelmingly against that proposition. And you didn't start picking up support in that proposition until you moved to the outskirts of the neighborhood. And I think that was the most telling thing. And the crossover between the politics. I think the politics exist in our city right now to, in fact, get that done. And I think it's going to take those communities and the people in those communities standing up and saying that they want it, but it can't be dependent on that because it doesn't happen. Because those people don't show up at school board meetings, they don't show up at land meetings, they're busy in terms of what they're doing, but they show up and they vote every 2 years, and I think that the political leaders need to look at that chart. I would take that chart, I would paste it to everybody's door, and I would say, this is how elections go. And so
Well, and I think the mayor has, helped focus us a little bit more on kind of an optimistic note, and I'm usually not that optimistic because I'm so focused on racial wealth inequality. And
well, you made me go first.
yeah, no, it's good. And done reports about how African American wealth is on the path to zero wealth, and pretty much if you look at the numbers, people like to say with race relations generally, we're not where we want to be, but we're getting there. But in terms of race and economics, we're not getting there, right? We're in the wrong direction. But to pick up. This is my way of being optimistic. But to pick up on the mayor's optimism, I do think there's more conversations now in the national light about dealing with policy that could directly affect economic inequality and racial economic inequality than I've ever heard before. And so that is exciting and interesting. One thing I would like to challenge Mr. Reeves on a little bit is, your work I found so interesting and exciting because it really does help. Everybody wants to say they're middle class. And I think your work helps break that out. But I don't quite understand, why do you call the upper 20% upper middle income? I mean, if you're the top 20% in one of the richest countries in the world, not if you are, I am, a lot of us in this room are, why even call us upper middle income? That's not middle. We're high income. For a lot of us, we're rich, right? Now, might not have the wealth that some of my compatriots have, but I'm just kind of wondering why, because I think your work does so much to kind of help break up that we're all middle class, but you still kind of use this language of upper middle income when I think we need to go higher and just recognize that we are high income, we're part of what needs to change.
Well, actually, my publisher wanted me to say upper class, because that's a lot fewer words, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of ugly, and I refused because it's hard enough to get Americans to agree that they're even upper middle class, let alone upper class. And so I wanted it to be a term that at least some people might be willing to accept that they fall into that group, because as you say, people think they're middle class. Interestingly, there are quite big race gaps in how people report their class position. And actually, so I actually think that the language of class is used in a racially exclusionary way. Sometimes, if you say middle class or even working class, I think sometimes the kind of prefix white almost doesn't have to be added to it. And controlling for income, black Americans are less likely to say that they're middle class. So actually the way that class and race intersect in the US, I think is difficult. That's why I did it. But I think this kind of point about, I want to come back to the moral argument in a moment, but the racial wealth gap, which I had that one chart, and you know this better than me, but the trend. And it's one reason why I think we see such strong downward mobility for black Americans as well. Right, so actually you see downward mobility from the top. In fact, the Times used the Chetty data about 2 months ago to create a really stunning interactive, which you haven't seen. It does shows by quintile, and it shows kind of just downward mobility. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, upward mobility for black boys is the really big problem. And it relates to place quite strongly. So black women actually have similar upward mobility rates to white women, but black men have very low upward mobility rates. And it looks as if black men are much more strongly affected by place. So in other words, Baltimore, which I know is one of the places you've looked at, actually growing up as a boy in Baltimore massively negatively impacts your future. Growing up as a black girl in Baltimore doesn't seem to. I'm not saying it's great to grow up as a black girl, but in Baltimore, don't get me wrong, but the gender difference is there. So you get wealth, you get gender, it all kind of impacts on itself. And this comes back to your point about intentionality, I think, Mayor, which is that we did have intentional public policy around housing. It intentionally excluded a lot of people on the basis of race. Now we have intentional public policy that excludes people on the basis of income.
Which is another way of excluding people in many
which
ways.
Has that effect,
yeah.
And so the principal wealth generating mechanism that white middle class Americans had post-war was specifically ruled out for black Americans. And actually, so unless you're going to do something very radical, wealth building is a housing issue. I don't know if that's part of your argument, Mayor, as well, that housing equals wealth and opportunity and therefore kind of equity. Is that part of the moral argument that you make?
I think that is part of the moral argument. And the question is, and I think you pointed out earlier, that if there was a city that was doing something that was actually and effectively building wealth in communities that didn't have them, then we would all be doing that.
Right.
But I don't know where that example is. I don't know how you do that. And so many of the things that we're trying to do, the question that got asked up and your answer was Minneapolis. And it'll be good to see. Minneapolis has had a housing policy for 40 years that's been more progressive than other cities.
It's has very deep racial economic inequality.
Mm-hmm.
Minneapolis, right?
Well,
just highlighting that. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, but to the point. Where's the answer? Where's the answer to that question? And we get lost. I think the harder questions is that even on those issues, and even on the race issues, and tying it to the policy issues, it's just not clear what's right and what's wrong. If you look at what there was the transit election that just took place in Nashville, not too dissimilar from the transit election that this community will have in November of 2020. I firmly believe that we cannot do something about affordability in this city and access in this city if most of our city can't get around, and if it takes 2 hours to get to and from a doctor's appointment or to and from a job. That's part of the infrastructure we have to change. But the reason that was an unsuccessful election in November is because the progressive community that should have voted for that was divided over questions of what was racially equitable. And when you look at the debate that we had in this community about the Land Development Code and where it started to fold onto itself was when there were people in the community tangentially involved in this issue wanting to do what was right. It was not clear what was right, because the linchpins, the community voices that they were looking for to say what is the right and wrong decision, it was ambiguous. And I see that happen in cities, and it's become kind of, it's like the next generation. You said, you know, that people don't have to do anything, they just wait for the NIMBYs to come in. Well, now the NIMBYs can walk back, and they don't have to get involved in the debate, because all they have to do is create that level of moral ambiguity. And that's what we have to guard against in this city, and that's what we have to do a much better job of.
What are the most difficult arguments that you have to deal with? You said at the very beginning there are moral arguments for and against some of the policies you were talking about. What do you think are the most credible, or kind of what are the arguments you find most difficult to counter when you're arguing for more affordable housing, more investment in that?
In this city, it was the question that got asked on the board that you said, yes, maybe that's true. And it's the question of by doing what it is that we're asking to be done, are we increasing gentrification? Are we hurting, in fact, the communities that we're most trying to help?
Yeah.
In our effort to provide access and opportunity, are we, in fact, doing the exact opposite of that? And that's where I think our community falls in and of itself. The laws of supply and demand operate even in Austin, Texas, as they do around the world. It happens here too, but which is not to say that it is pure and there's nothing else that impacts that. And if you add 6 houses, you can't see a change in the community because 6 houses isn't material. But that doesn't mean that market supply and demand doesn't impact price. The hardest questions that we have are the ones where you're saying I can build missing middle housing in this community, but missing middle housing for who? If I put it into this community, it's still going to, it's not going to be an $800,000 home. It's going to be a $400,000 home. And how much should I work to create 2 $400,000 duplexes instead of an $800,000 home? And is it really true that if I create those 2 homes in that bracket, do I impact the pressure then on the housing in the next bracket? And does that have an impact on housing on the next bracket? It's systemic.
Yeah, and I'll put forward, and I think I see a lot of confusion happening based on a lot of people's just false narratives about how things work or what have you. I mean, I think you're bringing up meritocracy or what have you. A lot of people don't really understand, like, the American middle class, the white American middle class didn't happen by people just working hard, right? It was like massive investments that was particularly to white people. Once you start having that understanding, you start understanding, the way a middle class develops middle class wealth is through investments and shared resources, not just someone getting a financial education packet or saying, if you believe it, you can achieve it type things, right? So once you start understanding there's much more investments necessary, I think you can have a much better understanding. And 2, I'll put forward, I think the example you put forward, and this idea of gentrification, I wouldn't say gentrification is a good thing, because to me, gentrification isn't a mixed income neighborhood. It is beginning a mixed income neighborhood that will push out poor people, right? To me, that's what gentrification is. That's my concern about gentrification. So when you're saying we're doing something for, I think again, you gave a good example, for middle income housing, but that's $400,000 housing. That's not middle income, right? That's definitely not middle income for blacks or Latinos. And so it's better than the 800. But, that's why I've gone, I used to do multiculturalism, I worked for Reverend Sharp and some civil rights stuff, but I really like to focus on this race and economic space, because if you stick with the numbers, you really can follow the argument, right? And I think, one thing about Austin I find interesting is when you see the median income going up, you're saying, oh good, people are doing better. No, but are poor people doing better? Do an analysis there, because you have an increasing population, and you bring in a whole bunch of rich people, it doesn't mean the poor people have done any better, right? I'll leave it at that. Yeah. But I think this has much, and I'll put forward to you all about what can be done. I don't see this just at the city level or the national policy level, at the nonprofit level, at the foundation level. What are we really measuring? What are we doing? I've worked in various nonprofits, and I'm always amazed at what little analysis they have in their hiring practices. And what little analysis foundations have. What percentage of the money is going to black or Latino nonprofits, right? And people say, well, what's a black or Latino nonprofit? And I'm like, you know what I mean by that. And it's the nonprofits you're not funding, right? And so why? And then we want to talk about racial wealth inequality, but you're reinforcing it by funding it in white institutions, right? I always say the worst part of racial wealth inequality isn't that households are in asset poverty, it's our entire community. All of our institutions, higher ed institutions, businesses, for-profit, nonprofit, are all massively undercapitalized. And so we need to, in whatever space we are, because I don't mean to be disempowering by the conversation, but if you work at a foundation, you work at a nonprofit, how much are you contracting with minority businesses? What are you doing and how you can move those things forward as we're waiting for larger policy at the city, state, or federal level, because we need that. Your little positions won't end racial economic inequality, but the things we can do in our work, because this isn't a disempowered room. This is a room full of people who are actually movers and shakers in their community. Where is your racial economic inequality analysis in the work you're doing?
So let me ask a question.
Yeah, because he's got us going now, hasn't he?
I don't know, and that's good. But let me ask the question. The hard questions to ask, because I would love to know the answer to this question. It's something that the Mayor Pro Tem and I have in front of us right now. And it relates to gentrification, it relates to housing policy. In Texas, we don't have the inclusionary zoning tool. We don't have rent controls. We don't have things we can impose. The only way that we can create in a gentrifying area mixed income opportunities is to plant it by incentivizing it. So we can give someone an additional benefit in order to be able to create and plant permanently an affordable unit. So someone comes into the city council, they are now own, they've become owners of an apartment building that has workforce folks in it. And the question is, they come in and they say, I want to redevelop this. Now in the marketplace, they have the ability to be able to redevelop that apartment exactly the way that it is. And if they do that, and they either tear it down and rebuild it, or they go in and they add $15,000 a room, they're going to change out the flooring and the countertops and appliances, and they'll rent the whole building tomorrow for 40% more. And in this city, we have 42,000 of those units, and in the next 10 or 12 years, we will lose all of them in this city to gentrification. So that person comes in and says, I want to take this apartment building, and I want to upzone it, and I want to get it more density, I'm going to increase the number of units, and I will give you some percentage of it permanently affordable, 10%, 15%, whatever it is, the numbers that work. And everyone in that building comes in front of the council and says, don't let them do that. Because if they do that, I'm going to have to leave. I may not be lucky enough to be part of the 10% in that unit. And the neighborhood comes down and they said, don't let them do that. And I'm sitting there looking at that and I'm wondering, if I don't do this in 10 years, none of those people and their families will be there. Yeah. If I really 10 years from now want to plant permanently in this neighborhood, mixed income opportunities, and communities of color that will forever be in this neighborhood, then now is the time for me to be able to do that. But yet, all of the NIMBY forces in my community and a lot of my social equity voices in my community are coming into me and saying, don't do that. Yeah. But yet, if I don't do that, I don't know that I will ever, I don't know. Well, what do I do?
So
what do we do?
Well, politically, you shouldn't do it because the benefits of it, if you bake in some affordability, but you're going for a market-driven strategy, right? You want a market-driven strategy that creates mixed neighborhoods and opportunity, right? So you've got to change incentives in the market. Unless you're going to do it all through public housing. And there are now FIMBYs as well, if you've heard of them. There's NIMBYs, YIMBYs, yes, and FIMBYs, public housing, the kind of public housing, NIMBYs, basically. Who kind of, so you have these weird alliances of people with a stake in the status quo. And on the one hand, you've got the kind of, obviously, the upper middle class people who are hoarders, but then you've got other people like, this is risky, right? It's a risk. And the benefits of that market-driven strategy will be felt long after you've left office, honestly. So if I'm your political advisor right now, I'm like, why would you spend political capital on that? Because your successors are going to get the benefit from it. But if you really want to do the right thing, you've got no alternative but to have a kind of market-driven strategy, which means some people who you don't want to get hurt, some will get hurt in the short term. But in the long run, more of the people you care about will benefit if you loosen up the market and you incentivize mixed communities. Otherwise, you have this status quo where you've got upper middle class people kind of here against it, and other people who are kind of worried about gentrification and displacement, which I get, against it, and you just get stuck. And unsticking that is politically really difficult. So, you want my political advice? Don't do it. You want my economic opportunity advice? Absolutely do it. Because otherwise what you get is these cities, and I work quite a bit in Charlotte, which is these cities where I think that bypass cities in the sense that you create opportunity and jobs, and they just bypass whole communities. There is no relationship between job growth and upwards mobility in US cities. And the reason for that is because you can create lots of jobs, bring in people to fill them, or give them to the people who are already going to get them, and the people who are already there or excluded from the neighborhoods don't get them. And I'm going to go now. Last point, 2 more points. One, and I'm going to slightly disagree. I'm going to agree with you about one thing and disagree with you about another thing. Okay. One, I'm going to agree with you about the non-profit thing, which comes back to social capital and networks. One of the reasons why philanthropists keep funding the people that they've always funded is because they know them.
Yes.
Real hard to pull funding from the person you're about to have dinner with, or you're on another board with. You know them, and they're in your network, and then you take a risk on a Black or Hispanic, smaller one who you don't know. And we're kidding ourselves if we don't think philanthropy is driven as much by social networks and who you know as it is by kind of evidence, right? So I strongly agree with you about that. I disagree with you a bit about 400,000 isn't affordable. I'm not saying that I agree with that statement, but we need to, I think this is what the mayor said, we need to be affecting the market at every single level. We just need to open supply. And so if I can get more $400,000 homes in the places that were at 800, and more $200,000 homes in the ones that were 400, and the more, I've just got to, I need to hit it everywhere, at every level, because otherwise all we do is we only focus on having very low income folks, right, really affordable housing. We actually need to shift the whole market. And if you could just move the whole market 10% that way, it does loosen supply. So I'm not saying $400,000 is affordable. I'm saying if I can get the $400,000 people in that neighborhood, that creates supply in that neighborhood, which creates supply in that neighborhood, which creates that supply in that neighborhood.
So what I'll jump in onto this is, I don't know, obviously, what you should be doing. I would love to look over for a few months and try to figure out, is there something that could be done that would
we could set you up here.
Well, I like to come out here, so yeah, I would love that. But I will put forward, I think whatever decision is, we need to be radically truthful, and even that can be politically negative for you. Meaning, and again, I'm a part of liberal nonprofit groups. We always want to say that what we're working on is the solution, right? And we oversell what we're doing. But we have to say, if all we can do is saying we're putting $400,000 and that's a step in the right direction, it's got to radically say that and say yes, and it's not dealing with the median household for African Americans who are making, $40,000 median household income in Austin. No, this isn't really going to help you. No, it's not. But this is something in a longer process. And then they're going to remember, what are you doing to help me? And it's a hard conversation. But we just have to stop, I'm in company, but really stop lying, because we do. As nonprofit organizations, we say, foundations, liberal groups, we're saying that we know how important it is, we've done the analysis, and this will solve it, but it doesn't solve it. And then people look at you and say, well, we can't follow you anymore. There is no policy solution. People start believing that actually there is no way to solve this issue, but it's because we don't even do policies that are really designed to hit the people who we're selling them to, like kind of the middle class, middle income voter. And again, I think it's really important for people to understand middle income isn't much money, right? Middle household income $60,000, and for black middle income, it's $35,000 household, not an individual. And I was just talking to a nonprofit friend yesterday. I said, isn't it weird? We're in the nonprofit elite and we're fighting for salaries that are like 5 times that of moderate income African Americans or Latinos, and we think we're developing economic development plans for these communities, but we have no idea how to create a financially secure household at $40,000. Now, I can ask my mom, she had to do it, at $20,000, but those aren't how our basic financial education plans, which won't solve racial economic inequality. But I think at least they could be designed to actually deal with the wealth inequality that does exist, but kind of went off in different tangents.
What cities do you see that are doing something right?
Doing well, and let's say this, different cities are doing different individual interesting things. I think, but part of the problem is you have to be realistic. It's a holistic problem, right? And it's a national problem. Again, it does amaze me that across the country, I haven't seen a place where African Americans and whites have very close income. Actually, the depressing places, the places where I see that most likely is in the South Bend, Indiana, where there's so few jobs there, that the white median income has gone down to about 50. Yep. Black median income is not moving that much. Miami, I guess, has seen the lowest at 25,000. So there's a little bit of a bridging there, but it's not because of growth. It's because of decline, right? So, I think there are cities that are, I'm for a whole host of policies. Minimum wage, a living wage for a minimum wage. This idea, people putting forth bold policies of these ideas around full employment, or if you don't even do smaller types of programs, these kind of, summer, paid job programs. But we got to be honest again, these are small pieces of a large puzzle that needs to occur. And again, I think we so much get focused on a small piece, we can't be honest and say, and we know that's not enough. That's just step 3 of a 200 level, step space that we're really going to have to radically change the economy in order to make it an inclusive space for working class people.
Yeah. I'm really struck by the work of Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton on baby bonds and wealth redistribution. I think there comes a point where if you want a more equitable distribution of wealth, you have to redistribute wealth.
That's right.
At some point that becomes an unavoidable conclusion, if that's what you want. And I'll argue for that, actually. And I think that some of the arguments for sort of race-conscious policies is how I like to sometimes think of them, which is you can have policies which, because of the way they're framed, they're going to be disproportionately beneficial to people from certain racial or ethnic groups. but they're not. But you don't label them that way.
That's right. You can take the race and economics and say we're going to focus on
Yeah.
people of this type of income, this type of
Exactly.
assets, and that will get to your black
Yeah.
Latino. It doesn't have to say only black people, only Latino
Right.
people. You can do race-conscious
And
policy.
you do sort of so they have these ideas about baby bonds, asset-based welfare. There's a lot of work from Melinda Lewis and others on kind of like 529s for poor people. I didn't say actually that 529s college savings accounts not only survived, they've now expanded them so you can use them for private K-12 education as well now. It's actually gotten worse. I know that the White House ordered 6 copies of my book after Trump got elected, and my worst fear is that they read it and went, 529s, what a great idea. Let's do more of it. Like literally the worst kind of impact. I really hope that's not true. So we kind of expanded it, but I think we have to loosen the housing market. We have to have more inclusionary zoning. Housing is a way to build wealth, but my God, it takes a long time. And I agree about the trajectories of wealth. And I think some of these interesting arguments are happening now politically about wealth. And you've got, Ta-Nehisi Coates, I think, writing quite cogently about reparations.
Sure.
And you've got Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, which I think is profound. Around the kind of systematic exclusion of black Americans from these major wealth-creating opportunities.
And Mirza Baradon's book, The Color of Money, talking about banks and the
banking.
racial wealth gap. And I think it was, again, because we all have to recognize, like, we are in a structure or in a path, and I'm assuming someone's holding time. Like, I'm not.
I have no idea what's
and I can talk about this for hours.
Yeah, same here.
Okay.
Should we take questions? All right.
And let me just say one last thing is just that we all have to recognize that we are in a system that is set up to fail. I mean, in terms of racial equity. I think that's a huge step forward, and then we can start understanding
Absolutely.
we have to do all of these different things, these radical types of things. And it's very exciting that so many presidential candidates are talking about, even I think Elizabeth Warren's affordable housing proposal really could do some very important things around racial wealth inequality.
Okay, all right. Should we go to questions then? We're not really in charge here. It's very anarchic. But May, do you want to should we have the mayor face the voters?
We're ready. Let's have some questions.
Go on. Yes. And we've got 15 minutes left, so we can do Q&A. Shall I moderate? Am I supposed to be moderating
That'd be
anyway?
great. That'd be good.
I have no idea what I'm doing. Right. And we can use the funny thing.
Yes.
Slido. Do you just want to do that?
Either way, we have microphones in the audience.
All right, let's do a couple of live ones as well. I think that's kind of like, let's do human ones as well as
There's
Slido.
someone.
There's a hand.
Yeah, go on. Yeah. Could you give us your name as well, and then a question, or at least like have the tone of your voice just rise at the end of, it's sort of rising tone.
Yes, my name is Barbara Scott. I am the president of the Colony Park Neighborhood Association here in Austin. I live in an area that is economically disadvantaged. Austin is one of the most segregated, economically disadvantaged cities in the country. This was perpetuated by the 1928 plan that was written by our then city council. The problem that I see in our area is that when we find a business or a project that will bring some economics to that area, then we have people from the other parts of town that think that it's not a good idea, and then they're lobbying city council, and we don't get those businesses. So how do we combat that?
They don't think it's a good idea,
Yeah,
that
why?
the business comes into your community?
Or why?
Yeah, well, we were told that, I'll just go with the golf course that was going to come out in our area. It was a PGA golf course. We had worked with the developer to make sure that the neighborhood and the neighborhood children and families would have jobs. They were going to work with our 501c to make sure that we were included in this. Powers that be decided that no, why would you want to build a golf club in that area when you can't afford to go to it? My statement was, how do you know what I can afford to do? So instead of being built out there where it would have done the most good, it was built in another part of town. And that part of town, which is already predominantly what I would call rich part of town, is reaping the benefits of something that a community that really was in need could have benefited from. So how do you combat that when you have people in all over, your city that thinks think that they know what you need and what you don't
It's a
need.
different kind of NIMBYism in a way, isn't it? But
Yes.
for different motivations, maybe. I think it's partly what you were speaking to, Mayor. I think is this sort of sense that people are resistant maybe to even these sorts of changes.
I think so too, and part of it is a struggle to try to find out what the right answer is. Ms. Scott and her folks have done just an incredible job of advocating for a part of our community that has never had the institutional investment that other parts of our town have and other neighborhoods have had. And you're absolutely right that you get the differences not by circumstance. You get it's because it is the natural outcome of the way that we invest. So there's a significant amount of investment that she and that group has been able to get to that neighborhood. It's going to get real significant investment on the order of like Mueller that we got out in Colony Park. But again, we have a large park out in that area, and the community is looking at that and saying, give us investment out here. The idea was to do a golf course. The question that was asked about that was, is a golf course going to be the right vehicle to drive jobs or to drive economic activity? Is that the best way to get economic activity? The folks in the neighborhood look at us and say, at least it is some investment. And this is better than nothing.
Yeah, better than what, right?
Better than nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And those words have been haunting to me in that area, because how do we make policy when the neighborhood is looking to you and saying, this is better than nothing? We have to be able to do significantly better than nothing.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes an issue.
This might speak to the wealth point and the economic security point, is that if you feel economically insecure, then change is definitionally threatening. Even if there are people making an argument for it, you just don't know. And so the fear of the unknown, I think, can really be strong for people who are feeling economically insecure. So this whole thing kind of comes full circle. I think maybe it would be good, maybe it wouldn't. Yeah, so there is sort of sometimes what compared to what? Well, it's kind of compared to what I know now, right?
Right.
And so risk, and actually I think the appetite and capacity to manage risk and confront risk is one of the deepest inequalities in our society. Let's take one of the questions on here as well. Look, that one's got 12 votes, and that one's got 11 votes. Let's do the criminal history one, because that kind of came up first. So I'll say something about just going to get us going as kind of affordable housing. First of all, I don't know how it's used here, but it's a very difficult policy question, actually, the criminal history thing. I know that in the employment market, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So a lot of the evaluations of ban the box actually haven't come out the way that a lot of people hope they would.
Yeah.
Because it has its unintended consequence, which is by not allowing employers to ask the question, they don't know, so they assume. And so actually it's pretty good evidence it's had some negative impact on hiring, particularly of black men. No, it's not the intention of the policy at all. So just wonder about this, whether it's true in housing as well.
And, you know, I'll put forward, I used to work in a maximum security prison coordinating a college program there, and then doing some work with kids whose parents were incarcerated. And, you know, I think again, with racial economic inequality, people like to conflate everything into like race issues. And so everything about like, I'm coming in to talk about racial economic inequality, and people ask me about police brutality, right? Or they ask me about like, and police brutality is bad, right? And mass incarceration is really bad. But I really haven't seen serious studies that show that those who are incarcerated from inner city ghetto neighborhoods are doing a lot worse than those who weren't incarcerated,
right.
Meaning they're all doing so bad.
That's right.
Right, like even those without whites with criminal records do much better than blacks without criminal records. But if you take the kids from the neighborhoods where there is mass incarceration, whether they have a record or not, they're not doing well. They're being discriminated against. So I mean, we need to deal with these issues of mass incarceration and lessen that. But I think again, it's much more how are we getting one of the most depressing things for me when I was working at the maximum security prison, it was maximum security prison for women. I would drive out to this area, to the prison, and come home. And I realized the women in the prison had more programs for them in the prison than they did in Harlem, where I was driving back to. And that was it wasn't depressing going into the prison, it was leaving it and realizing that once the women get out of the prison, they're in some ways, they have less programs to assist them. So I just think it have to be a little bit more complicated. Oh, into your point, I don't think there's some easy way to all of a sudden convince everyone of this is the right thing, but I think that's why you have to have long, ongoing conversations, because people really are fairly ignorant about this and start developing a consensus about, how bad is it? And if there is no other project, then yes, some project in your neighborhood is better than, because again, I'm all about the racial wealth divide, but I'm not just trying to solve it. Like I didn't say this, median wealth for black people in 2016 was 3,600, depending on how you measure it. The median wealth for white people was 147,000. And I just want to put that out there because I think that helps you understand the economic security. If the median wealth, not poor black people's wealth, the median wealth is $3,600, you understand how a car accident, how losing your job is a financial disaster that will keep you, so I just want to highlight the scope of the problem. But
Yeah, and the recession, of course.
Yes.
Just the disproportionate kind of impact. There was a little bit of black wealth before the recession,
Yeah.
and now.
I mean, it's a problem. I mean,
they've
even
got
without the recession, right, at the high point of black wealth since 1983 was like $14,000,
Yeah.
right? And so, yes, the recession was really bad, but, we never had much of any type of financial security to begin with as a whole.
Yeah, the gap's gotten wider because black wealth went from here to kind of here,
Yeah.
and white wealth went from there to there, and white wealth is now recovering more quickly. So as a proportion, the ratio has actually gotten wider because of that kind of disproportionate shock. Should we do the school one, Mayor? I'm hoping you'll be able to answer this. The top question here is the school district is closing schools because there are some under-enrolled schools in poor neighborhoods. Is that true? And what's everyone's nodding, so it obviously is true. Yes. What does that mean for equity? Is this something that you feel you can speak to?
Well, what I can say is that I'm just really happy that I'm not on the school board. Because this is, again, one of those issues where people so love their neighborhoods and they want to have a school that is close to their home and with their neighbors that they've grown up with, that the children have grown up with, and there's community surrounding them, and the schools are the centers of these neighborhoods. But you also have a school district that is not financially operating in a way that will enable it to survive and provide the education that it needs. So we are confronted now with having to close schools. And the schools where the greatest unenrollment exists are in the neighborhoods that are shifting and changing. It's the historic old neighborhoods, and as more and more people move in without kids, kind of the gentrification issue.
Yep.
There aren't kids, so there aren't kids in the school. So they might be the first schools that you would close. I hope that it can be done equitably. I don't know how that is. I know that just closing the schools where there are not children is not the right way to do that, because then you're just taking the schools out of those communities and you start institutionalizing the historic issues.
I think you bring up a point. I'm sure Angela's going to help us a lot with this later. That the challenge is, how do you act equitably in an inequitable system, right? It's like, how do you, if the housing's all segregated, and you keep low-income people over here, and they have bad institutions, then of course, when you're looking at what you're going to do with the institutions, you're going to close the bad institutions, but that's not solving the problem. Right? That's just continuing the problem. I think there was a really interesting analysis around integration of schools. And for some reason, in the 50s, integration meant that we can get rid of black schools and bring black kids into white schools and lose a lot of the black teachers. Black teachers were much more academically credentialed than white teachers, because the only thing you could be with a degree was a teacher if you were black, right? And destroyed that institution that was weak and underfunded, and then try to integrate them into another one. So from the very beginning, we kind of, in terms of school integration, we set on a wrong path. And I think, again, you're just highlighting the challenge of trying to act equitably in an inequitable system. We have to be kind of radically honest about what we're doing the best we can, but this isn't enough. We have to do some other things. But I know we only have a few more minutes.
And it also means that you have to be really careful what you measure, right? You might end up with some more integrated schools as a result of this, on some measures. But schools resegregate within the school.
Yes.
Sometimes what that means is that some people are having to travel a lot further, and in this case it might be the kids who are low income who are being bused.
Or you have your GT programs.
Yeah, and they disproportionately. And so
that become the whites.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of almost the point you started with, which is to say that there's lots of competing goals here, and just kind of really clear, what are we after here? What's happening to the median? What's happening, and what's actually happening to what is happening to, say, the academic performance of black or kind of Hispanic kids, right, in those schools, rather than how mixed is the school. That's not to say that isn't important. Bob Putnam has this book, Our Kids, and he talks there about, he has this great phrase where he says, if you want a more equitable school system, you can move the parents, move the kids, or move the money. Housing, busing, finance. right? And maybe you want to do a bit of all of them, but there's a beautiful clarity to that. Because it's like, well, what are you going to do? You've got to do one of the others. I suggest we go to a real person rather than one of these for our last question, because there's something, I sense your question's awesome.
Hi, thank you. My question is that as we have established the middle class in this country and the upper middle class in this country did not happen by accident. And so when we talk about deregulating the land code, we can't pretend and fall into the fallacy of a trickle-down affordability just from the magic of deregulation. So what kind of guardrails do we have to have even while deregulating in order to actually have the true affordability come out of a deregulation process? Thank you.
Right. Do you want to try that? I think this would be our last
I was
one.
looking to the mayor.
Let's give the mayor the last word. So, do you want to tackle that, and then I'll go?
Well, I mean, I guess to be radically honest, like I don't have a specific example of the guardrails for what you put forward. I do think you're on the right path to a solution, and that recognizing there has to be very specific guardrails to make the type of change you're looking for. And I'd be interested in seeing what you find out and seeing if there's some people at NCRC or researchers that can help look for other models. That's the one big thing that I'm most excited about the work I do is there's more conversation, Sandy Darity, Derek Hamilton, on national policies, and that's important. But local best practices that deal with racial economic inequality, it's almost completely, it's very absent. It's very absent, and would like to pull these together more and share those more and highlight those so we can, not everybody's starting to create the wheel all over again. We can share off our shared best practices and policies.
And this maybe the mayor will be able to kind of pick up this question here about it's 35 years old as well, and there is how do how do we change the conversation? But I'll just my brief response to that is, so it depends where we think the problem is. Of course we want protections, of course we want to be inclusionary, of course we want to make sure there's affordability, but I think the main problem with the US housing market overall is not that it's under-regulated, it's that it's over-regulated. And it's over-regulated particularly at a local level. And actually something more approximating a free market would be more equitable than what we've got right now. So it's a kind of weird alliance in a way between some people on the right and some people on the left. We have a rigged housing market. It's rigged. It's rigged in our favor. It's highly regulated. It's also highly subsidized through mortgage interest deduction. And so it's the way it's regulated through the financial industry and who gets it, the way the credit scoring system works to get in there in the first place. So this idea that we have a kind of free housing market is in my view, completely wrong. It's highly regulated, highly subsidized in all different ways. And the question is, who benefits from those regulations? Is it a regulatory system overall, including tax, local regulation, that benefits people who are low income and low wealth? No. We have a system of regulation that benefits people like me. And so I want less regulation of the housing market, and I think it does create some political opportunities because it's a market-based approach. Mr. Mayor, you have the last word.
The question up on the board is, how do you show that this is racist? I think the answer to that question is go outside. But I want to key on the word just for a second, the word racist or racism, and I think that we really need to have a conversation about that word itself. In the aftermath of that shooting, when we formed that task force on institutional racism, systemic inequities, the number of people that came to me and said, I love this idea, I want to be part of this, but would you call it something else? Because racism was too incendiary a word, that people wouldn't participate if we used the word, because they want to be part of the conversation, they want to be part of the solution, but they're not racists. And the belief is that people wouldn't participate. And what that showed us more than anything else is that we actually had to use the word because we have to use the word for something that what it is. And to say that there is racism that exists in the regulations that we have is not to say that we are bad people or that we have black hearts or evil motives in terms of what we are. That is not to say that. It is to say that race at its very core is a determiner of what it is that happens in our city. So to say that our policies are racist is not to say that we are bad. It's to recognize the very direct and market result of the institutions that we have. The question about how do you put on guardrails, I mean, I think that we have to do as much as we can within the system that the state has given us to drive permanent affordability and permanent mixed income opportunities in our city, because that's the only tool from an institutional basis that we have, and we need to maximize our opportunities to be able to do that.
Please join me in thanking the questioners and my fellow panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.